Dawn had not yet broken over the narrow valley when the first scouts reported movement along the ridge. The date was late summer, 480 BCE. The location was a narrow strip of land in northern Greece known as the Pass of Thermopylae. Mist drifted across the rocky slopes, and the sea nearby was calm enough to reflect the fading stars. At first glance, nothing about the place suggested that it would soon become one of the most famous battlefields in ancient history. But among the soldiers standing quietly behind the stone wall, that morning was a man whose name would echo for thousands of years. His name was Leonidas I. History would remember him as a heroic defender of Greece, a warrior king who led a small band of Spartans against the massive army of Xerxes I during the Battle of Thermopylae. The story would eventually become legend. Centuries later, it would inspire books, films, and myths of impossible bravery. But legends rarely tell the entire truth. Behind the polished image of Spartan honor and sacrifice lies a darker and far more complex story, one that ancient historians themselves hinted at but which modern retellings often ignore. To understand that story, we must begin long before the battle itself. In the city-state of Sparta, life followed rules unlike those of almost any other Greek society. While cities like Athens celebrated philosophy, trade, and democracy, Sparta was built entirely around war. From birth, Spartan citizens lived under a system designed to produce soldiers. Ancient sources describe a practice that shocked even other Greeks. When a child was born in Sparta, the infant was brought before elders who inspected it carefully. If the child appeared weak or physically imperfect, the elders could order it to be abandoned. According to later writers such as Plutarch, these infants were left in the wilderness near a place called the Apothete. Whether every detail of this practice occurred exactly as described is still debated by historians. But what is certain is that Spartan society placed extreme value on physical strength and military potential. This was the world into which Leonidas was born. Leonidas was not originally expected to become king. He was the third son of the Spartan ruler Anaxandridas II. Under normal circumstances, the throne would pass to his older brothers. Yet the unpredictable nature of Spartan politics eventually placed Leonidas in power. By the early 5th century BCE, tensions between the Greek city-states and the expanding Persian Empire had been growing for decades. The Persian ruler Xerxes planned a massive invasion intended to bring the Greek world under imperial control. Ancient writers claimed that Xerxes gathered one of the largest armies the ancient world had ever seen. The numbers reported by historians such as Herodotus are debated today, but even conservative estimates suggest a force vastly larger than the Greek defenders. When news of the approaching Persian army reached the Greek cities, a fragile alliance began to form. Several city-states agreed that the best place to slow the Persian advance was the narrow pass at Thermopylae. The geography of the pass was crucial. Steep mountains rose on one side, while the sea pressed close on the other. In places, the path between them narrowed to only a few meters wide. For a smaller defending force, this meant that the massive Persian army could not easily surround them. Leonidas was chosen to lead the Spartan contingent. But the army he brought with him was surprisingly small. While modern retellings often speak of the 300, the total Greek force at Thermopylae was closer to 7,000 men. The famous Spartan warriors were only a portion of that group, joined by soldiers from other Greek regions including Thespiae and Thebes. Still, even 7,000 soldiers were vastly outnumbered. The early days of the battle followed a pattern that seemed almost unbelievable. Wave after wave of Persian troops attempted to break through the narrow pass. The Spartans and their allies fought in tight formations, their shields locked together. The terrain prevented the Persians from using their numbers effectively. For 2 days, the defenders held their position. Ancient accounts describe how Persian commanders repeatedly sent fresh troops forward, only to see them pushed back by the disciplined Greek line. Even the elite Persian unit known as the Immortals reportedly struggled to break through. From a distance, Xerxes himself is said to have watched the fighting from a throne placed on a nearby hillside. At this point in the story, the legend begins to take shape. But the situation was about to change in a way that few of the defenders expected. Somewhere in the surrounding mountains existed a narrow path known to local residents. This trail wound behind the Greek position and allowed someone familiar with the terrain to bypass the main pass entirely. A local man named Ephialtes of Trachis approached the Persian forces with information about this hidden route. The reasons behind his decision remain unclear. Ancient sources suggest that he expected a reward from Xerxes. Whatever his motivation, the information he provided would soon prove decisive. Under cover of night, a Persian force began moving along the mountain path. By morning, the defenders at Thermopylae were facing a dangerous reality. Persian troops were approaching from behind. It was at this moment that Leonidas made the decision that would define his legacy. According to historical accounts, he dismissed most of the Greek army, allowing them to retreat and warn the rest of Greece. But Leonidas and his Spartans remained behind, along with several hundred Thespians and a smaller number of Thebans. Why he made this decision is still debated. Some historians believe it was a strategic delay intended to buy time for the rest of the Greek alliance. Others argue that Spartan law may have discouraged retreat in the face of the enemy. What is certain is that the final stage of the battle would be brutal and brief. Surrounded on both sides, the remaining defenders fought until their lines finally collapsed. Leonidas himself was killed during the fighting. Ancient sources describe intense clashes around his body as the Greeks attempted to prevent the Persians from capturing it. Eventually, the defenders were overwhelmed. The pass fell. From a purely military perspective, the Persians had achieved their objective. But the story did not end there. The stand at Thermopylae quickly spread through the Greek world as a symbol of resistance. Even though the battle had been lost, the delay it caused helped the Greek alliance organize further defenses. Later that same year, Greek naval forces achieved a decisive victory against the Persian fleet at the Battle of Salamis. Another year later, the Persian land army was defeated at the Battle of Plataea. Over time, the sacrifice of Leonidas and his soldiers became one of the most powerful stories in Greek history. Yet historians continue to examine the darker reality of the society that produced him. Sparta's military system depended heavily on a large enslaved population known as the helots. These people, primarily from the region of Messenia, were forced to farm the land and support the Spartan warrior class. To maintain control over this population, Sparta developed harsh systems of surveillance and intimidation. Ancient sources describe practices such as the crypteia, in which young Spartan warriors were sent into the countryside and sometimes ordered to kill helots suspected of rebellion. These details complicate the traditional image of Sparta as simply a heroic warrior society. Leonidas himself was a product of that system. He was trained from childhood in the Spartan military program known as the agoge. The training emphasized discipline, endurance, and loyalty to the state above all else. In this environment, personal identity was often secondary to the needs of Sparta. This is one of the reasons modern historians caution against viewing the events at Thermopylae only through the lens of heroism. The men who stood in the pass were undoubtedly brave soldiers, but they were also participants in a society built on rigid control and constant preparation for war. The difference between legend and reality is often subtle. Centuries later, the story of Leonidas would be retold again and again. Poets, historians and filmmakers would each reshape the narrative in their own way. The battle itself would become a symbol of courage against overwhelming odds. And yet, when we look closely at the surviving evidence, the picture becomes more complex. Leonidas was neither the flawless hero of legend, nor the monstrous figure some modern interpretations suggest. He was a king shaped by the harsh system of Sparta, placed at the center of one of the most dramatic confrontations of the ancient world. The narrow pass at Thermopylae still exists today. Tourists walk across the ground where the battle once took place. The coastline has shifted over centuries, and the mountains have changed slowly with time, but the location remains recognizable. Near the site stands a simple monument honoring the defenders. It carries a brief inscription, attributed to the poet Simonides of Chios. The message is simple. Traveler, tell the Spartans that we lie here, obedient to their laws. Those words capture the strange balance at the center of the story. Duty and sacrifice. Loyalty and control. Heroism and harsh reality. More than 2,000 years later, the figure of Leonidas continues to stand at the center of that contradiction. And perhaps that is why the story of Thermopylae has never completely faded into the past. Because sometimes the most powerful legends are built on truths that are far more complicated than the stories we choose to remember. The story did not end with the fall of the pass. When the last defenders at Battle of Thermopylae were finally overwhelmed, the Persian army continued its march south into the heart of Greece. The narrow corridor that had delayed them for several days now lay open. Reports of the defeat spread quickly across the Greek world. Messengers traveled from city to city carrying news that the Spartan king, Leonidas I, had been killed and the defensive line had collapsed. For many communities, the immediate reaction was not heroic pride but fear. The Persian army was still advancing, and nothing stood between it and several of the most important Greek cities. Among the first major targets was Athens. Unlike Sparta, Athens relied heavily on its navy rather than a purely land-based military system. Its leaders had already begun preparing for a possible evacuation, knowing that the city itself could not be defended against the enormous Persian force. Under the guidance of the Athenian commander Themistocles, thousands of civilians were transported by ship to nearby islands and coastal regions. Homes were abandoned, temples were left unguarded, and the city's population scattered across the Aegean. Soon after, Persian troops entered Athens. Ancient accounts describe fires spreading across the city. Buildings were damaged or destroyed, including parts of the sacred Acropolis. What had once been one of the most vibrant centers of Greek culture now stood largely empty. From a strategic point of view, the Persian campaign seemed to be succeeding. Yet beneath the surface of these events, something else was happening. The stand at Thermopylae, although a defeat, had achieved something important. It had bought time. The delay allowed the Greek alliance to prepare for the next stage of the war. Naval forces gathered near the island of Salamis, and plans began forming for a confrontation that would take place not on land but at sea. It was during this tense period, as the Persian fleet moved into position, that the memory of Leonidas began to change. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, his death had been one more tragic loss in a dangerous war. But as stories spread, the details began to take on symbolic meaning. Greek soldiers who had fought at the pass described how the Spartan king had refused to retreat even when the situation became hopeless. They recalled the moment when he dismissed many of the allied troops, sending them away so they could continue the fight elsewhere. Gradually, the story transformed into something larger than a military event. It became a statement about resistance. This shift did not happen overnight. It developed through speeches, poems, and historical accounts written in the years that followed. One of the earliest historians to record the events was Herodotus. Writing several decades after the war, he gathered stories from survivors, travelers, and local communities. His work remains one of the most detailed surviving accounts of the conflict between Greece and Persia. Yet even Herodotus' narrative contains contradictions. Some witnesses claimed Leonidas knew about the mountain path before the Persians used it, but chose to stay regardless. Others suggested that the discovery of the betrayal by Ephialtes of Trachis came too late for an organized retreat. There were also questions about the exact number of defenders who remained for the final stand. While the famous figure of 300 Spartans became widely known, additional fighters from cities such as Thermopylae reportedly stayed behind voluntarily. These men, often overlooked in later retellings, fought and died alongside the Spartans during the final hours of the battle. This raises an important question for historians. Why did the story eventually focus so heavily on Sparta and Leonidas alone? Part of the answer lies in the reputation Sparta already possessed within the Greek world. Spartan soldiers were known for their discipline and training, and their society was built entirely around military identity. The idea of Spartan warriors fighting to the last man fit neatly into the image that other Greeks already associated with them. But another factor was political influence. After the Persian Wars, Sparta became one of the most powerful forces in Greece. Its leaders had every reason to emphasize stories that reinforced their reputation for strength and sacrifice. Over time, the narrative of Thermopylae became a symbol not just of resistance to Persia, but of Spartan superiority. Yet if we examine Spartan society more closely, the image becomes more complicated. Sparta's military system depended on a large population of enslaved people known as helots. These individuals were primarily from the conquered region of Messenia. They were forced to work the land, producing food and resources that supported the Spartan warrior class. The relationship between Spartans and helots was tense and often violent. Historical records describe frequent revolts by helot populations, some of which required large military responses to suppress. Because the number of helots greatly exceeded the number of Spartan citizens, the ruling class lived in constant fear of rebellion. This fear shaped many aspects of Spartan life. Young Spartans underwent intense military training from an early age in a system known as the agoge. They were taught endurance, obedience, and combat skills, but they were also conditioned to view helots as enemies who might rise up at any moment. Some ancient sources describe a secretive institution called the Crypteia. According to writers such as Plutarch, young Spartan warriors participating in the Crypteia were sent into rural areas with minimal supplies. Their mission reportedly included monitoring the helot population and eliminating individuals considered dangerous. The exact nature of the Crypteia remains debated among historians, but its existence reflects the extreme measures Sparta took to maintain control. This environment raises uncomfortable questions about the society that produced Leonidas. The same system that created highly disciplined soldiers also relied on constant repression of a large enslaved population. Spartan freedom, in many ways, depended on the labor and suffering of others. For modern audiences accustomed to the heroic narrative of Thermopylae, this context can be difficult to reconcile. It forces us to consider the possibility that the legendary stand of the Spartans was not simply an act of noble sacrifice, but also a reflection of the rigid values imposed by their state. Spartan law placed enormous emphasis on obedience and honor in battle. Retreat was often viewed as disgraceful, and the expectations placed on Spartan warriors were severe. Leonidas, as king, would have been especially bound by these expectations. Some historians believe that even if he had wanted to retreat, doing so might have been politically impossible within the Spartan system. His role was not only to command, but also to embody the ideals of the state. In this sense, the decision to remain at Thermopylae may have been shaped as much by social pressure as by strategy. Meanwhile, events elsewhere in Greece were moving quickly. The Persian fleet, commanded by Xerxes' admirals, began advancing toward the narrow waters near the island of Salamis. Greek naval forces, led in large part by the Athenians, prepared for what would become one of the most decisive naval battles in ancient history. As ships gathered in the straits and soldiers prepared for another confrontation, the memory of the fallen Spartans at Thermopylae hung heavily over the Greek alliance. Their defeat had demonstrated the immense power of the Persian army. But their resistance had also shown that the invaders could be slowed. The coming battle at sea would determine whether Greece could push back the invasion entirely, or whether Xerxes' campaign would continue unchallenged across the mainland. In the months and years that followed, the figure of Leonidas would become larger than life. Poets would celebrate his courage. Historians would debate his decisions. Political leaders would invoke his name as a symbol of duty and sacrifice. Yet beneath the growing legend remained the complicated truth of the man and the society he represented. Leonidas had been raised within one of the most disciplined and severe cultures of the ancient world. He had ruled a state that depended on constant military readiness. And he had died in a battle that was both a tragic defeat and a strategic delay. The narrow pass where he fell would soon become sacred ground in Greek memory. But the full story of Thermopylae, its heroism, its contradictions, and its consequences, was only beginning to unfold. The months following the fall of the pass were filled with uncertainty across the Greek world. The death of Leonidas I at the Battle of Thermopylae had already begun to circulate through soldiers, stories, and scattered reports, but the war itself was far from finished. The Persian king Xerxes I still commanded an enormous army, and much of mainland Greece remained exposed. Yet the stand at the pass had changed something in the psychology of the conflict. Before Thermopylae, many Greek cities believed resistance to the Persian Empire might be impossible. The Persians had conquered vast territories across Asia and had already subdued powerful kingdoms long before reaching Greece. But now there was proof that their armies could be slowed. Even in defeat, the resistance had forced Xerxes to spend precious time and resources pushing through the narrow corridor of land between the mountains and the sea. That delay had allowed Greek commanders to prepare a second line of defense, this time far from the rocky cliffs of the northern pass. This next confrontation would unfold in the narrow waters surrounding the island of Salamis. The naval forces gathering there represented one of the largest fleets ever assembled by the Greek city-states. Warships from Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and several smaller allies converged into a single formation under a fragile alliance. The Athenian commander Themistocles played a central role in organizing the fleet. Unlike the Spartan kings who dominated land warfare, Themistocles understood that the strength of Athens lay in its navy. For years he had argued that Greece's best defense against Persia would not be fought on land but on the sea. Now, with Athens already burned by Persian forces and much of its population evacuated, the stakes were higher than ever. While the Greek fleet assembled, Xerxes positioned his own ships across the nearby coastline. His navy was immense, drawn from many regions of the Persian Empire, including Phoenicia, Egypt, and the eastern Mediterranean. From a distance, the Persian fleet appeared unstoppable. Yet the geography of the straits near Salamis created conditions similar to those at Thermopylae. Just as the narrow mountain pass had limited the movement of Persian infantry, the tight waterways would restrict the maneuverability of large fleets. Themistocles believed this could neutralize the Persians' advantage in numbers. Ancient sources describe how he used a mixture of strategy and deception to lure the Persian fleet into the straits. According to several accounts, messages were secretly sent to Xerxes, suggesting that the Greek alliance was on the verge of collapse, and that an immediate attack might destroy their fleet before it could escape. If true, the plan worked. The Persian fleet moved into the narrow waters, expecting an easy victory. Instead, they found themselves crowded together in a confined space where coordination became difficult. Greek ships, designed for ramming attacks, began striking the Persian vessels one by one. The result was the Battle of Salamis. From a hillside overlooking the water, Xerxes reportedly watched the fighting unfold. What he saw was not the swift victory he expected. Greek ships maneuvered aggressively through the congested Persian formation, striking with bronze rams and forcing enemy vessels into one another. The confined space turned the Persian numerical advantage into a liability. By the end of the battle, a significant portion of the Persian fleet had been destroyed or scattered. The defeat forced Xerxes to reconsider the entire invasion. Without naval superiority, maintaining supply lines for such a massive army across hostile territory became extremely difficult. Eventually, the Persian king withdrew much of his force back toward Asia, leaving a smaller army behind to continue the campaign. The following year, that remaining force would be defeated by Greek land armies at the Battle of Plataea. With that victory, the Persian invasion of Greece effectively ended. As the immediate threat faded, the Greek cities began to look back at the events that had brought them to the brink of destruction. Among those events, the last stand at Thermopylae stood out as something unique. The location itself soon became a place of remembrance. Travelers passed through the region, stopping near the battlefield where the Spartan king and his companions had fallen. A memorial was eventually erected there, bearing a short inscription attributed to the poet Simonides of Chios. The message was simple and direct. It did not describe glory or conquest. Instead, it spoke of obedience to Spartan law and duty to the state. That detail reflects something important about the values that shaped the men who fought there. For Sparta, loyalty to the laws of the city was considered the highest virtue. The Spartan military system demanded that soldiers place the needs of the state above personal survival. From early childhood, boys were trained under the strict discipline of the agoge. They learned to endure hunger, cold, and physical hardship without complaint. Failure was not merely discouraged. It was treated as a source of shame that could follow a person for life. In such a system, the concept of retreat was deeply complicated. While many Greek armies might withdraw and regroup if a battle turned against them, Spartan culture placed immense pressure on warriors to hold their ground. The social consequences of abandoning a position could be severe. This cultural expectation helps explain why the final moments at Thermopylae unfolded the way they did. Leonidas and his remaining soldiers did not simply fight because escape was impossible. They fought because their entire upbringing had conditioned them to believe that surrender or retreat would dishonor the laws they were sworn to protect. But the Spartan system that produced this level of discipline also carried darker elements. As historians continued to examine ancient sources, they discovered that Spartan power depended heavily on the forced labor of the helot population from regions such as Messenia. These helots worked the land, providing food and resources that sustained the Spartan warrior class. Without their labor, the Spartan system could not have functioned. Yet the helots lived under constant threat of punishment and violence. Ancient accounts describe periodic campaigns in which Spartan authorities declared ritual war against the helot population, allowing young warriors to kill suspected rebels without religious consequences. The institution known as the Crypteia, mentioned by writers like Plutarch, may have played a role in this system of control. If these reports are accurate, they suggest that Sparta maintained its military dominance through a combination of discipline and fear. This reality complicates the traditional narrative of heroic Spartans defending freedom. While they fought against Persian rule at Thermopylae, their own society was built upon the subjugation of others. Modern historians often describe Sparta as a state defined by contradiction. It produced some of the most formidable soldiers of the ancient world, yet it also relied on harsh internal systems that limited freedom within its own borders. Leonidas himself existed within that contradiction. He was both a king who stood against one of the largest empires of his time, and a leader of a society that depended on strict hierarchy and control. Over centuries, storytellers would choose which parts of that reality to emphasize. Some would focus on courage and sacrifice. Others would point to the rigid and often brutal structure of Spartan life. What remains certain is that the events at Thermopylae cannot be understood in isolation. They were part of a larger conflict that reshaped the ancient Mediterranean world. The defeat of the Persian invasion allowed the Greek city-states to develop independently for generations afterward. Philosophy, art, science, and political ideas that later influenced much of the world emerged during the centuries that followed. Yet behind those developments lies the memory of a narrow pass between mountains and sea. A place where a small group of soldiers made a stand that would echo through history. And at the center of that moment stands the figure of Leonidas, a king whose legacy continues to provoke questions about courage, duty, power, and the complicated truth behind the legend's history chooses to remember. Years passed after the defeat of the Persian invasion, and the battlefield at Battle of Thermopylae slowly returned to silence. Grass grew over the ground where thousands of soldiers had fought. The coastline shifted gradually as centuries passed, and the narrow strip of land where the armies once clashed widened with time as sediment from nearby rivers pushed the sea further away. But the memory of what happened there did not fade. Across the Greek world, the name of Leonidas began to move beyond the realm of simple historical record. His final stand was retold in conversations among soldiers, in speeches given by political leaders, and eventually in written histories compiled by scholars. Yet as the legend grew, the real details of the man himself remained surprisingly limited. Unlike many famous rulers of the ancient world, Leonidas left behind no personal writings, no surviving speeches, and very few records describing his private life. Nearly everything known about him comes from later historians piecing together fragments of information. This makes reconstructing his personality difficult. What can be established with some certainty is that Leonidas was shaped almost entirely by the culture of Sparta. From early childhood, he would have been placed into the Spartan education system known as the agode. This system separated boys from their families and placed them under the supervision of state instructors who focused on building endurance, obedience, and combat ability. The daily routines were harsh. Food was intentionally limited to encourage resourcefulness. Physical punishment was used to reinforce discipline. Young trainees were expected to endure pain and discomfort without complaint. The purpose of this system was not simply to create strong individuals, but to produce soldiers who would place the needs of the state above everything else. By the time Leonidas reached adulthood, this philosophy would have been deeply ingrained in his thinking. In Sparta, citizenship itself was tied to military service. A man who failed to uphold the expectations of courage and discipline risked losing respect not only from fellow soldiers but from society as a whole. This cultural pressure formed the backdrop against which Leonidas eventually became king. When he inherited the throne after the deaths of his brothers, Sparta was already a powerful and feared military state. Yet it was also a society constantly balancing internal stability with external threats. One of the most persistent concerns was the possibility of rebellion among the helots. These enslaved agricultural workers, many originating from the conquered region of Messenia, greatly outnumbered the Spartan citizen population. Maintaining control over them required continuous vigilance. Ancient writers described systems designed to intimidate and monitor the helots, including the controversial institution known as the crypteia. According to accounts preserved by historians such as Plutarch, young Spartan men participating in this secretive organization were sent into the countryside to observe the helot population and eliminate individuals considered threats. Whether every detail of these accounts is accurate remains debated among scholars, but there is little doubt that Spartan society relied heavily on strict control over its subordinate populations. This reality forms an important part of understanding the environment in which Leonidas ruled. While later generations would celebrate him as a symbol of freedom resisting imperial domination, the system he represented maintained its own hierarchy of power within Greece. At the same time, the broader Greek world was changing rapidly. Following the victories at the Battle of Salamis and the Battle of Plataea, the immediate Persian threat to mainland Greece faded. The empire of Xerxes I remained powerful, but its attempts to conquer the Greek peninsula had failed. With the external enemy temporarily pushed back, attention among the Greek city-states began to shift inward. Alliances formed during the war started to weaken. Rivalries that had been set aside during the Persian invasion gradually resurfaced. Two cities in particular stood at the center of this emerging tension. The first was Sparta, still respected for its military discipline and leadership during the land battles of the Persian Wars. The second was Athens, which had grown dramatically in influence due to its naval power and its central role in defeating the Persian fleet. Over the following decades, these two powers would drift toward confrontation. But during the early years after the Persian Wars, the memory of Thermopylae still served as a unifying story. Greek poets and historians presented the battle as a moment when different city-states stood together against a foreign empire. In this narrative, Leonidas became the central figure. The simplicity of the story helped it spread. A small group of soldiers facing overwhelming odds, a king choosing to remain behind while others withdrew. A final stand that delayed an invading army long enough for the rest of Greece to prepare its defense. These elements made the story memorable. Yet historians who examined the event more carefully continued to point out details often overlooked in popular retellings. For example, the defenders at Thermopylae were not limited to the famous 300 Spartans. Several thousand allied soldiers fought during the early stages of the battle, and hundreds from cities such as Thespiae remained until the final moments. The betrayal by Ephialtes of Trachis also played a crucial role in shaping the outcome. Without his knowledge of the hidden mountain path, the Persians might have required far more time to break through the Greek position. And the decision to hold the pass, while courageous, was not purely symbolic. It served a strategic function by slowing the Persian advance and giving the Greek alliance time to reorganize its defenses. These complexities reveal that the battle was not simply a story of heroic sacrifice, but part of a larger military campaign with practical consequences. Still, the symbolic power of the event continued to grow. Centuries later, travelers passing through the region of Thermopylae would stop to observe the monument erected near the battlefield. The inscription attributed to Simonides of Chios remained one of the most famous lines of ancient Greek poetry. Its message was directed not toward glory, but toward duty. It told those who passed by to inform the Spartans that the soldiers who died there had followed their laws to the end. In that single sentence lies the essence of Spartan identity. Obedience, discipline, loyalty to the state above personal survival. These values define Leonidas more than any dramatic legend created centuries later. When modern audiences look back at the story, it is easy to imagine a heroic figure standing defiantly against impossible odds. But the historical reality is both more restrained and more revealing. Leonidas was not a mythical warrior carved from legend. He was a king raised in one of the most demanding military cultures in the ancient world. His actions at Thermopylae reflected the expectations placed upon him by that system. And his death became a symbol not because it was extraordinary in isolation, but because it captured the values that Sparta believed defined its identity. In the centuries that followed, historians would continue to debate the meaning of that moment. Was Thermopylae primarily a heroic sacrifice, a calculated military delay, or a reflection of the rigid social structure that governed Spartan life? The answer may lie somewhere between all three. What remains certain is that the narrow pass where Leonidas made his stand became one of the most powerful symbols in the history of warfare. A place where legend and reality meet, and where the story of a king, shaped by one of the most disciplined societies of the ancient world, continues to echo through history. In the decades after the Persian invasion, the story of Leonidas' I and the stand at the Battle of Thermopylae continued to spread across the Greek world. But time has a way of changing the meaning of events. For the soldiers who had actually fought in the narrow pass between the mountains and the sea, Thermopylae was a brutal and chaotic battle. It was filled with exhaustion, confusion, and the terrifying reality of facing an enemy far larger than their own forces. For later generations, however, the battle became something else. It became a symbol. Writers and historians began shaping the narrative into a story about resistance and duty. The Spartan king who had died defending the pass was gradually transformed into an example of unwavering loyalty to law and state. Yet even in the ancient world, some observers recognized that the story contained contradictions. The same society that celebrated discipline and courage also relied heavily on rigid control and hierarchy. The warriors of Sparta lived lives of intense training and strict obedience, but their way of life depended on the labor of the helots taken from regions like Messenia. This uncomfortable reality rarely appeared in the heroic retellings. Instead, the focus remained on the dramatic final stand. The image of a small group of warriors holding a narrow passage against a vast invading army was powerful enough to overshadow many of the more complicated details surrounding the event. Centuries passed, and the political landscape of Greece changed repeatedly. Empires rose and fell. New cultures emerged. Yet the memory of Thermopylae continued to survive in historical writings. Among the earliest and most influential accounts was the work of Herodotus, who recorded the Persian Wars in the 5th century BCE. His narrative preserved many of the details known today about the battle, including the betrayal by Ephialtes of Trachis and the decision by Leonidas to remain behind with a small force. Later historians added their own interpretations. Writers such as Plutarch examined Spartan customs and attempted to explain the cultural values that shaped the actions of the soldiers who fought at Thermopylae. What emerged from these accounts was a portrait of a society defined by extremes. Sparta valued courage, discipline, and loyalty above nearly everything else. Its warriors were trained to endure hardship and to obey the laws of the city without hesitation. But those same values also created a rigid system in which personal freedom was often secondary to the demands of the state. Leonidas lived and ruled within that system. His final decision at Thermopylae cannot be separated from the expectations placed upon him as a Spartan king. Retreat in the face of the enemy would have carried enormous social and political consequences. Remaining in the pass, even when defeat seemed certain, aligned with the ideals that Spartan society had taught him since childhood. In that sense, his choice was both personal and cultural. The battlefield itself eventually became a place of quiet remembrance. Travelers visiting the region encountered a monument near the site where the defenders had fallen. On it appeared a short message attributed to the poet Simonides of Chios. The inscription addressed those who passed by. It asked them to carry a message back to Sparta, that the soldiers who died there had obeyed the laws of their homeland. No grand celebration. No detailed description of the battle. Just a simple acknowledgement of duty fulfilled. Over time, the coastline near Thermopylae slowly shifted, and the exact shape of the ancient battlefield changed. The narrow path between the mountains and the sea widened, transforming the geography that had once defined the conflict. Yet historians and archaeologists continued to study the area, piecing together evidence about how the battle unfolded. What they discovered reinforced a simple truth. Thermopylae was not a miracle victory or a mysterious disappearance into legend. It was a carefully chosen defensive position held by a coalition of Greek forces attempting to slow a powerful invading army. The strategy worked for a time, but the discovery of the hidden mountain path allowed Persian troops to outflank the defenders. In the end, the battle was lost. But the delay created by that stand contributed to later Greek successes, including the victories at the Battle of Salamis and the Battle of Plataea. Those victories ensured that the Persian invasion of Greece would ultimately fail. And so the legacy of Leonidas remains balanced between two realities. On one side stands the legend, a fearless king and his warriors defying overwhelming odds in a final act of sacrifice. On the other side stands the historical record, a disciplined army carrying out a difficult defensive mission shaped by the values and pressures of one of the most rigid societies in the ancient world. Both versions contain elements of truth. Leonidas was a capable military leader raised within the demanding culture of Sparta. His decision to remain at Thermopylae reflected the expectations of that culture and the strategic realities of the war against the empire of Xerxes I. But history rarely produces simple heroes or villains. Instead, it leaves behind complicated figures shaped by the circumstances of their time. The narrow pass at Thermopylae still exists today. Visitors walk through the area, often unaware that the shoreline once pressed tightly against the mountains where armies clashed more than 2,000 years ago. There is no sound of battle now. Only wind moving across the landscape, and the quiet presence of a monument reminding travelers that long ago a group of soldiers stood there, following the laws of their homeland to the very end. And somewhere between the legend and the reality, the story of Leonidas continues to endure.